How many of you rode a bike when you were younger? How many of you rode a bike when you were younger without a helmet? How many of you fell off your bike when you were younger? How many of you fell off your bike, banged your head against the pavement, got a blood clot and died? Because that's what will happen if you go out without a helmet. And actually, I suppose, we didn't really have helmets when I was younger. Had we have done, I'm not sure would I have wore it, maybe, maybe not. So what I've said to my daughters is, look, I'm happy for you to go out on your bike around the village green area and the grass without a helmet. But if you go on the main road, I want you to wear the helmet. Because the risk is more significant on the main road, probably than it was when I was younger. So that's what I stipulate. Why do they still not go out on the bike? Well, the answer to that is simple. I'm married and my wife wears the trousers in our house. And if she says, I'm not bothered what your dad says, it's helmet or no bike ride. So they don't ride a bike. Which is quite sad, because that's something now that they're not going to be exposed to. Sensible, pragmatic. These are words that keep coming up all of the time. What is risk assessment actually about? Identifying what the hazard is. What's the hazardous event? And what's the likelihood of the hazardous event having an impact upon us? What would that consequence be? Once I've done that, I need to determine whether that is acceptable or not.
IOSH Networks Audio.
This stage is a little bit loose. Yep. What could happen? I could trip over it. I could fall onto this nice woolly carpet. What could happen? I could hit my head against that A-frame there. I could get a blood clot. I could die. What have I now just gone and done? I've gone to worst case scenario. Yep. Actually, if I was to trip on this carpet here, what would happen? Apart from all of you having a great laugh at the fat bloke at the front that fell over, because it's a great story to tell your friends. What injury is foreseeable if I was to fall on this? Probably a carpet burn, something like that. True? I suppose the fact I was away from home last night, it might be tricky explaining, but go with it. You wouldn't expect to die. Therefore, I look at the consequence. What's the likelihood of it actually happening? Probably very unlikely. Risk significant, yes or no? Probably not. Acceptable, yes or no? Move on. We've done it. But actually, I can create 5 pages if I want, just on that very stage. Because in law, we talk about common knowledge, we talk about industry knowledge, and we talk about expert knowledge. But yet, so many times, I hear companies say to me, you see them procedures, they're idiot-proof. What does idiot-proof mean? Does it mean we never ever allow for common knowledge? And the reason I say this is because if we tie everything together, how big does the book get? And the really important things are somewhere in that book, true? But they get lost. And our job is to make sure the important things don't get lost. To make sure the significant risks and the controls that come from them are publicised. And people know about it. I've got many examples of where risk assessment, I would say, has gone wrong. Where we haven't thought enough about the control measure that we're putting in place. Do some work in food manufacturing. They have trays that have got hot ingredients in them. The risk assessment says, if any of the hot materials fall out, you could get serious burns. They rated it as a high consequence, i.e. it's going to kill you. Likelihood of it happening, highly likely. They used a scoring system 5 by 5. 25, high risk, stop immediately. I'm in this area with the manager and I'm looking at the risk assessment, and guess what I'm also looking at? Them trays are exactly the same as they were. The recommendation on the risk assessment said only half fill them. When I spoke to the manager and said you should only be half filling them, what do you think he said? How am I meant to fill them only half full? Because if they're only half full, what does that mean? I need twice as many trays, twice as many wheels, twice as much space, and guess what? There ain't no more space. But the fact that risk assessment was there, and it said stop immediately, what would the impact be if something had have happened? If the HSA went in to investigate, rightly so, they would ask for an assessment. The assessment says stop immediately. You've done that yourselves. Yeah? Have we actually potentially put our company at risk because of what we've created? We've created something that's not practicable, not workable. Yet if you'd have actually spoke to the manager and involved that manager in the risk assessment, guess what you'd have realised? They've been doing that job for 25 years. They had one burn to somebody's arm. As a result of that burn, they did react to it. Guess what they did? They provided protective sleeves, because they said it's foreseeable that actually that could happen again. So if it happens again, we'll give them protective sleeves. What's the likelihood of that actually occurring whereby somebody is harmed? High, medium or low? So would you ever get to a high risk that says stop immediately? That's the sensible and the proportionate part of risk assessment. Only if we deem that risk to be unacceptable do we then put in control measures to start to mitigate that risk, i.e. the risk should go down. So in your risk assessment, how many of you do a risk assessment, put in control measures and then do a risk assessment again? I.e. 2 sets of scores. Brilliant. Why do we do 2 sets of scores? Because the second one is demonstrating that if you do that, it makes a difference. I see lots of risk assessments that have 1 set of scores and recommendations. If they had have assessed it again, guess what they'd have found with that recommendation? It wouldn't have worked. And time again, when I think about sensible and pragmatic risk assessment, it all comes down to the fact we didn't involve the people that does the job. A driver was reversing his truck through a DIY chain over in the UK. An old lady was behind the truck and unfortunately it was fatal. When the enforcing authority went in to investigate, they asked the manager, could they see the risk assessment for moving vehicles through the customer car park? When the manager got asked that question, what do you think he thought? Please let me have one. So he went to the file in the office and opened it up. And as he started flicking through it, what do you think he was hoping for? Please let there be a risk assessment. And sure enough, there it was, a risk assessment. All to do with vehicles moving through the customer car park. One of the hazards identified was vehicles reversing with blind spots. The consequence was hitting a customer and it being fatal. So we're talking a high consequence. Probability, the assessor had put down as medium. It ended up as a medium risk. Recommendation: drivers must only drive forward through the car park and reverse when they're on the loading bay yard. Whose fault is this accident now? The driver. The driver was interviewed. The driver was shown the risk assessment. And what do you think the driver said? I've been coming here 12 years and nobody's ever said that to me. I've never seen that in my life. The driver then says, and anyway, if you reverse, if you were to drive forward through the customer car park, that loading bay is not big enough to reverse in. So you still have to come out and reverse in. Who did the risk assessment? The safety advisor that drives a Fiat Panda. What does he know about a 40-foot Arctic? But what did that risk assessment actually do for that company? It identified what the risk was, but it put in an ineffective control measure. Therefore, did we do anything with regards to trying to protect them customers? Absolutely nothing. So if the risk assessments we produce doesn't actually do anything, what is the point? Every time you create anything, there must be an output. Otherwise, what's the point? We're there to ensure that we're looking after people's safety. So it means that I've got to be sensible in my recommendations. The Health and Safety Executive in the UK have a document called 5 Steps to Risk Assessment. It's fairly simple. It starts off by saying we need to identify the hazards. We then need to decide who might be harmed and how. The third stage is evaluate the risk and decide on precautions. Now, when you read that third stage, what is that always gearing you towards doing? It's always gearing you towards doing something. But sometimes, when you actually identify and evaluate the risk, guess what you might find? It's safe. There are no problems with it. But if the document is gearing you towards putting something in place, guess what we always end up doing? If we do a risk assessment, we have to come up with a procedure or some form of control measure. Whereas probably 90% of what we do, you would actually say, is quite safe. Do you need to risk assess a kettle? Well, let's think about what do we know about kettles. Boiling hot water, burny hot. Electricity and water, not a nice combination. 5-page long, what am I going to recommend at the end of it? Don't touch, yeah, and don't put water on the plug before you put it in. Guess what? When I was 3, Mummy and Daddy said, son, that's a kettle, burny hot, don't touch. And now I'm 28, just go with me on the age thing, makes me feel better. Yeah. I've now got a 5-page procedure, tell me. So do you need to risk assess the kettle? Well, the answer is it depends, because not all areas are the same. It depends where the kettle is and what we're doing. I've facilitated a risk assessment in a children's home. These kids were aged 11 to 16. I went into what looked like a normal domestic kitchen. I'd got one of the care workers with me, and I'm looking at the kettle thinking, well, I'm not going to start going into the ins and outs of a kettle because it's a simple piece of kit. Yep. And when I spoke to the care worker, I asked the golden question, anything dodgy? He says, that kettle. I'm thinking, these are kids 11 to 16. Yeah, would they know that kettles are burning hot? Well, yes, they would. But the kettle wasn't so much that it was burning hot. The kettle was a weapon. Because she then explained how the cable's been round the care worker's necks twice in the last month. Now do I need to assess it? I think so. Why? Because actually there's a bit of evidence now that says this is quite significant. What control measures are we going to put in place to try and make that a little bit safer? So, in theory, you can only risk assess activities that goes on in workplaces. But yet some people believe you can risk assess empty rooms. You know, if we were to risk assess this room, you know, how many significant hazards would we identify? Probably not many. How much would we have down on our risk assessment documentation? Probably not a great deal. But I can change that very quickly. Risk assessment, ultimately, is all about betting on the favourite option. There is no legal expectation to expect the unforeseeable. Pragmatic, sensible risk assessment is about involving the people. It's about identifying what it is that's dodgy in the jobs that we do. And if you can go back and you can do that in the workplaces that you're in, I will guarantee that the whole risk assessment process will have a great deal more credibility than maybe it is at the moment. If you are wondering about did I ever break the record for pushing trolleys at Sainsbury's, unfortunately, this guy beat me to it. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your time today. Thank you.
IOSH Networks Audio.